Hi. Hi, how's it going, everybody? First of all, let me greet everyone a happy Women's Month. Welcome to PALAKwento. It's a show wherein we discuss everything under the sun in the field of landscape architecture here in the Philippines. So today's episode is actually kind of special because this is in partnership with the Environmental Landscape Studio Laboratory, or ELSL, of the UP College of Architecture. And so I am Bianca, your host for tonight, and I am part of the UP College of Architecture faculty. And so ELSL and PALA would like to dedicate this episode to the late landscape architect Dolly Perez, the mother of landscape architecture in our country. And she was one of the first to teach the course in UP Diliman. Although she worked on numerous projects with varying scales, we will be focusing on how she developed the literature on the design of private gardens while associating them to the concept of heaven and the Garden of Eden. And of course, these are highlighted and kind of became interchangeable in the two books she authored, namely Home Haven Heaven, published in 2007, as well as Your Garden, Your Eden, published in 2009. So yon. And to further explore this topic better, we have invited amazing guests for tonight. And so let me introduce you our first guest. He is a member of the faculty of the Department of Anthropology, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, or CSSP, at the University of the Philippines. His areas of interest include internet anthropology, economic anthropology with an emphasis on the relationship between values, consumer culture and management, as well as medical anthropology and the anthropology of martial arts as body practice with an emphasis on Filipino martial arts. So, in addition, he also teaches martial arts, focusing on Filipino, Chinese, and indigenous martial arts from Mindanao. And so his latest publications include Assertion of Mag-Indi Aita Identity Through Preservation and Revival of Games, Sanib Sapi o Tinotopak, Pastors and Priests on Possession, Psychosis and Their Resolution, and Martial Arts of the Philippines, Promoting Identities and Negotiating Unity in Diversity in Ryu Sokyol. So let's welcome my former Anthropology 10 professor, Professor Felipe P. Hocano Jr. Welcome po, Prof. Hocano, to
Hi,
Palakwento.
good evening. Magandang gabi sa lahat at
Yes, magandang
maraming
gabi
salamat.
po.
Thank you for inviting me sa ating palakwento. It's the first time, na may program na ganito and nakakatuwa, that we have things like this going on all the time. Ayun.
Yes, maraming
Oo.
salamat din po sa pag-accept
Mm-mm.
ng aming invitation.
Mm-mm.
Ayan. So,
Yeah.
Prof. Hocano, I believe meron po kayong inihandang presentation for us. And
Yes.
so, please start whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I'll just open with some preliminary remarks, no? Yeah, I'm Felipe Pihocano Jr. from the Department of Anthro. It's been a long time since nakita na kami ni Bianca. Was it a GE class ba? Yung sa
Yes,
akin?
yes, sir.
Anthro
Antro
10?
10.
Yun,
Yes.
Anthro of the Body. Yung interest ko din, actually, I had forgotten to add among some of the research interests, keep jumping all over the place kasi, yung folklore. Partly because of my dad's work in folklore and partly because of my previous research while in related to medical anthro. That's in one of the publications mentioned on Sanib Sapi and in relationship sa indigenous concept of mental illness. So why folklore? Well, actually, this is more about indigenous knowledge. How do we make sense of the world around us? And over time, as I began to read more from the documentations and then to talk to people, begin to understand how people make sense of the world. Kasi without a framework with which to engage the world, it's just a chaotic mass of impressions. So having a framework makes you make sense of that. And one of those is actually spatiality, right? So When we're first exposed to the indigenous worldview traditions, folklore, such as origin stories, such as yung kwento ng mga and then yung identifiable ano siya, it's always presented as a form of a children's story. But rarely do we have an engagement with these things as ways of making sense of the world. Now, for example, yung relationship sa mga engkanto, actually, sa totoo lang, tabi-tabi po, bago juminggan ang lalaki sa may puno, actually, ano yan eh, it's just basic courtesy. You know, excuse me po, pwede bang makiihi dito? Well, you know, so if you say excuse me, tabi-tabi po, oh, then they know enough to get out of the way. Siyempre din naman, as one friend of mine put it, kung naihian ka ng hindi mo kilala, di upakan na yun. Okay? Sampalan. Okay? If you know what I mean. And that's how it is. It's just about basic courtesy, good manners. No? But sometimes, in focusing upon only the apparent lack of factuality because of a scientific worldview, we forget that this is actually very much a relational thing. Okay? And it's in that context too that I want to approach what I'll be presenting tonight because there's more to understanding, let's say, traditional notions of Eden, of heaven, hell, and whatever. There's more to it because it involves our own history and it may also help us get an understanding of why, in spite of, or even with the veneer of Christianity, some of these ideas are still Father Bulataw and my dad, and of course, Dr. Virgilio. Meron kang dun sa labas, that's the umpina doon sa taas. That's the orthodox way of looking at the world. Christianity in both the Catholic and Protestant senses. But then below that is the indigenous worldview that depending on the place, sometimes mas malakas pa yung kapit doon. And then at some point, naghahalo in dalawa. Sometimes it's expressed in the form of ritual. Sometimes it's expressed in the form of art. And sometimes it's expressed really as a form of belief. There are many people who, or indigenize Christianity in many ways. And the concept of heaven, of Eden, comes from Christianity and Islam, by the way. Two religions that have made a major impact upon our history and still do even today. So they're both world religions. Okay, so if I can share something here, it's a PowerPoint. Slides, no, not Google Slides. Share screen. Oh my goodness. Okay, huh? Screen sharing. Yeah, okay. Let me see if I can. Okay, it's not there. Wait, Ayan. So I'm calling this up and let me see if I can do this. Let me see. I try again kasi it looks like it's the same as ano. Okay, I can't let me see. Not here. Ha. Here we are. All right. Got it. I clicked the wrong thing. So can everyone see? Is my screen now visible? Hello,
Yes,
Kabilang
yes,
Mundo?
Prof. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So here we go. Let me adjust the view a bit first. Now, here we are. Let me adjust the view so we can go to full screen mode. Yeah. Okay. So if it's visible, here we go. I'm titled this Kabilang Mundo, Explorations into Philippine Notions of the Other World in Mythology. Okay. A brief background then, I know little about landscape architecture. Let's be clear about that. But from the little that I have about notions of aesthetics in creating a landscape suggests that we have a common theme, which is that, for example, heaven, earth, man. And the notion of heaven, earth, man seems to be shared both by Western designers and, interestingly, by East Asian, especially. And that would be the first one I have heard this in another format in more detail was from Chinese cosmology. Okay, Uh, Tien for heaven, Lin, Tian Te Lin, heaven, earth, man. Okay? So, in any case, then, we go forward. Is there such an thing as equivalent to Eden or heaven in Filipino traditional worldview? Let's take a brief look now. In the Garden of Eden in Judeo Christian theology, especially in Genesis 1 and 2, was a special creation of Yahweh after he called the universe into being and set it into motion. And I call attention to Genesis 2, 8 and 9. The Lord God had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. That's Adam. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. And in the middle, this is where the notion of Eden also comes in as a strong moral teaching story. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life would come out again at Revelation. So it's very interesting if you read this text carefully. The order mentioned the tree of life will be at Revelation when Christ has come back and the earth and heaven have been rolled away and a new heaven and a new earth are created, and there you have the tree of life again. And once more, it's a garden. Now, you'd want to think, ano kayang context nito? No? Why are gardens so important? Especially when you read this as being part of, in a cultural sense, part of the cultural history of the Jewish people, and in a broader sense, those who partake of Abrahamic theology. Why are gardens so important? Well, among other things, as an expression of the views of the world. Remember, worldview. The garden is a sanctuary. Here is Eden. It's a special place. Gardens are sanctuaries. In the archaeological record, gardens from the major cities, such as those in uh, the cities of in Assyria, later in Babylon, and then in Egypt, gardens were also the preserve of the rulers. They were markers of status and of special ano to trying to capture this notion of status because they were the shelter for the ruler. In the Garden of Eden, it was also a sense of a place of perfection. So there is in fact then a continuity between cosmology and of course yung uh, personal expression in the physical world. And you find this once again in themes such as the powerful notion of the garden that you find it reflected in recent popular culture. Well, I'll think about the 20th or 21st century. Gardens play a role in many science fiction stories. Here's one, or in fantasy stories. If you've been a fan of the Lord of the Rings, both the book and the movie series, then you would realize that Rivendell is actually patterned after the garden in the Bible, and it was a sanctuary in which Sauron built in science fiction, a book by Herbert, and then the latest movie version, where the garden is a symbol of hope. And in because Frank Herbert had such a strong, well, he's such a strong ecological activist. Actually, he was expressing this through his writing. The garden was also the symbol of hope for the future. It was the preserve. It was where you preserve the seeds of the plants that would transform the world. This is, napakaraming meanings pala nito, but that's just still the Western view. However, when we come here to the traditional worldview, do we have an equivalent to Eden or heaven? See, the notion of Eden and of paradise um, is found in Islam, and it is that the root source would naturally be the Quran. Okay, so in its original form, and for those who have the time to explore the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, and to what does the Quran and the Hadith say about paradise or the equivalent of Eden. Now, this is an area where I think it would be helpful to explore because in the again looking in archaeology and world history, gardens were also part and parcel of the palaces of the Muslim rulers. And these were all over from Persia, okay, in the modern day Tehran, okay, to Persia, again from in Afghanistan, in Kabul, in Damascus, in Syria, and even in the on the edge of the desert in Arabia, in Morocco. And as far as when the Islamic empires, the different dynasties reached southern Europe, as far as southern Spain, the great cities of Toledo, of Al-Andalus, Andalusia, which earlier was known as Al-Andalus of Sevilla, they all had gardens in the palaces. And records would show too, or mention in literature, about gardens being the havens of scholars. So, again, once more, in Islam, the garden is also a very important motif, a very important theme, even in Islamic art. Okay, so you have the two inspirations for the notion of Eden or paradise, both of which had their effect upon Philippine cosmology over the centuries. In the indigenous worldviews, there is no mention or equivalent of paradise or Eden, except maybe among groups that have either been Islamized or Christianized. And so, of course, that would mean the dominant politically in that sense, perhaps the majority lowlander populations and coastal plains and coastal areas that had been reached by uh, Catholicism. Okay, and then for the highland groups that have also been reached to some extent by Catholicism, and then in Mindanao and in interiors of Mindanao as well as in the islands of Sulu and Tawi-Tawi, those are the ones that are more Christianized. Okay. Indigenous views of paradise and how to get there are tied up closely with the warrior cultures. For example, one thing I had been taught, and I did mention earlier that I do teach and do indigenous martial arts. One of the sayings that was taught to me, right, was in the use of a sword. What was the mindset of a warrior when he picks up and wields a sword? There comes a point when he has to charge forward into battle. Having trained and developed his skill, he is, he may or may not die, except by the will of Allah. Whether he lives or whether he dies. What is consistent here is the view of the way to paradise for the warrior who is in a righteous crusade, the jihad. And this is not just the jihad, but rather the final jihad when there is no other choice except to take up arms. And so paradise is found uh, on the edge of the blade. That's not clearly Quranic, but it does have an expression. It intertwines very closely with traditional worldview in among the warrior traditions, right? What about in Catholic views? Doing good deeds, having novenas, pray for you. It's your way to paradise, to Eden, to the other world, right? What about in Protestantism? Well, we'll get to that later when we look at the impact of colonization upon us. In examples because materials I am more familiar with compared to the others now. And this is one based on my father's work in Central Panay. The Panay epics, like the Epic of Labao Donggon, the Epic of the Hinilawod, you had to mention the sky world, underworld, and the earthly world. And here is something else. There's no mention of heaven, but there are three worlds that are remarkable parallels to each other. And they are reachable via long voyages across the seas and the mountains and crossing the rivers. And geographical rivers references include local landmarks as well as what lies beyond them. Mount Majaas in Antique, okay? And the Halawud River also there. I've been looking for adequate photographs of the Halawud River. I have a hard time, but we have one for Majaas. So it's spelled Majaas with a J or Madyaas, depends on your preference. And this was taken from the knowledge of the site PinoyMountaineer.com. Okay? This is still, and at least dito, medyo may marami-rami pang forested area siya. But this kind of terrain is also inspiration for the folk stories. The stories then of traversing the dangerous forests because you have the wild boars that live on the slopes, okay, climbing up the peak and then descending down to the other side. And of course, reaching the sea and crossing it to find another world that's similar to it. The hero Humadapnon, the hero of the epic The Hinilawod, crosses the sea with his companions and finds an island in which there is also a mountain in the center and there is a cave. So there's the transposition, there's always an actual geographical reference to this. But there's no exact garden. It's always a different world. When in the epic of Labao Donggon, the hero, uh, has three wives. The first wife comes from the middle world, the earthly world, the world where we all live. Then he heard of a beautiful and powerful woman of the sky world, of the underworld. And so he went down, okay? Remember yung geographic reference is downward. And then he entered the underworld. And again, there is nothing like the Western notion of the underworld with which we're familiar with. In Hades, for example, in Greek mythology, where all you have are the ghosts and the river Styx. When you cross it, you can't come back. Walang ganun yan. Instead, he just goes there. He finds the woman he has heard of and he is struck by her beauty and he decides to court her. So nakakabiyahe siya. So they cohabited for a while. He married her and they have a son. Meanwhile, he also has a son with his earthly wife. Then when he goes back up, depending on the version of the story, yung iba sumama din yung underworld wife niya and yung iba nagpaiwan doon. Yung isang version that I have, nagpaiwan siya doon. And he asked permission from his two wives to go look for another woman he had heard of. In the sky world naman siya. This is the famous Nagmalitong Yawa. Right? And in the beginning, since medyo nairita na sa kanya si wife number 2, ba't ka pa maghahanap ng isa pang asawa? Bakit? Kulang pa ba kami? Ano ba kulang naming dalawa? Sabi niya, insisted because that is the way of the male sa society nila. This is a polygynous society. So, the wives, reluctantly, sige na nga. And then he goes off to the sky world. Now, this is where things get a little bit different. It's like our world, yet not like our world. Bakit? Because when he went there, it turns out that Nagmalitong Yawa was married to Saragnayan, the Lord of the Sun. And as the Lord of the Sun, he drove the sun around using horses. Okay? Siya yung nag-guide ng araw. He was the sun god. And he said, of course not. I'm not going to let you take my wife from you. So, magduduelo sila. The long and short of the story is, he was defeated. He was turned into a huge pig. And he was imprisoned under, sorry, it's my alarm. He was imprisoned under their house and kept in there. And then, after that, his wives were waiting for him. They got impatient, and then their sons volunteered to go look for him. And in the ensuing battle, when they met each other in the middle of the sea, and then they went, joined, combined forces, found their father, fought Saragnayan, freed their father. Okay. And then, the story continues up to the point where Labao Donggon's brother now wants to go get married, and that's where the story ends. There is no mention, it is not like a paradise to which we are translated if we do good. Instead, it's just a totally different place where even humans may enter. So it's a totally different view. Other forms of indigenous worldview. Dr. Alicia Magos in 1992 in her work, The Undying Maarang Tradition, has a view of the world this time. Ano naman siya? 7 layers. The top layer is the top layer of the chief god Makaako, the creator. The fourth one is where we live. Below us, yan yung underground spirits. The second is that of the water beings. The last is uninhabited. It is pure rock. It's the base. Above the human layer, the fifth is the atmosphere, inhabited area spirits. The sixth is that of the ancestors and other kinds of spirits, pa, daming spirits, no? And the topmost layer is that of the chief god. And this is repeated all over again in the cosmogonies of other indigenous groups, especially those in Mindanao. Now, heaven or paradise or Eden was introduced by the Spaniards and then underwent a change in American rule. The Spanish era, one could go to heaven with the help of others praying for one's soul. And this led to a practice wherein novenas were paid for, and very subtly, many of the churches introduced a schedule of fees for novenas for the souls of the dead. This was a practice that was heavily criticized by Dr. Jose Rizal in both of his novels, De Noli Me Tangere and the El Filibusterismo. And well, among other things, then, his criticism was viewed as subversive because it was dangerous to the existing order. Under American rule, it was the Protestant missionaries who introduced the idea of personal salvation as the way to heaven, and therefore, and to God, and there was no need for masses or novenas to be said for the souls of the dead. And it should be, so again, we, I was once involved with a project on Christianity and Filipino culture. And one of the publications we came up with, the research team that contributed to this, was a study of Protestant Christianity. Okay, and in the Philippines, and the role of the missionaries in transforming indigenous views of the world. And here is something interesting. There may have been more of a bigger role in the ideas, to some extent, yung ideas then that permeated the revolution, because freeing people from the dictates of the uh, frailes, so to speak. That's why in some regions of Christianity so rapidly. Okay, so under both colonial views, whether in Christianity of both sorts, Eden is the place from which we came, to which one day we will return, although by then this is the new heaven and the new earth of the revelation. I had forgotten to add this, and I need to mention this now, even in here. What about contemporary Islam? Even heaven, paradise, is reflected once more in the worldviews coming from the fighters of the MNLF and the MILF. In one of the key works introduced, yes, by Dr. Ibrahim Sakili on Islamic worldview and on space and spatialities. Even the heaven is a place where the jihadists could go in their fight for Bangsamoro autonomy. During that period in our history, nung malakas pa yung bakbakan between the MNLF and the government forces. And therefore, some of the stories shared to Dr. Sakili included that when the fighter fell, yung comrades niya beside him swore that they heard wings, the sound of wings and the neighing of a horse. Ibig sabihin nito, this was the winged horse, the barak of the Prophet Muhammad, which already came for the soul of the dead and brought him to paradise. Okay? So even then, the notion of Eden of paradise undergoes once more a change given the political, economic circumstances of the time, and that includes even yung conflict situation. Going back then to the last. So what does the kabilang mundo really mean? And again, in this very all too brief overview of Filipino worldview. One, it's a reflection of this world. It's not necessarily heaven or hell. Many of the traditional stories show that the people from these worlds do the regular tasks same as people of Earth. Except for one thing, the animals, the beings that inhabit the world alongside the humans are not the same as that of the this world. That's one thing to consider. The kabilang mundo of traditional worldview is not necessarily heaven or hell. Heaven and hell were introduced first during the Spanish colonial period and then during American rule. The kabilang mundo is not always paradise. Again, in the narrative I've shared with you about the story of Labao Donggon, and then the more contemporary version of the other world as narrated by Dr. Alice Magos, and there's a lot more. But the kabilang mundo, the other world, can be a source of inspiration for design of space. Christianity and embrace paganism. Some people may react that way. But rather consider, what does it mean to have layers of space? What does it mean to consider being an entry into a different world and an exit back into the mundane, everyday world, where the notion of something that's so different, something you could also choose to stay in for quite a while and decide to leave when you need to get back to the world. These are, throwing this out, these are possible ideas that we can examine. And in fact, exploring indigenous psychology would also be great value here, because taking off from this, from the notion of the kabilang mundo, you also have these layers upon layers of intimacy, of bringing people closer to whatever you are, and it's reflected in the use of the personal space. Okay, and I'm going to stop my sharing here. Okay, so I'm going back here. So, um, in summary, this is what Filipino, at least in traditional Filipino worldview, has with regards to the notion of the other world and this present world. So, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I hope that this has been helpful, and we'll be more than happy to answer questions later.
I just have some follow-up questions, Prof. Ocano. But first of all, thank you for that very brief and fruitful presentation about
Thank you.
our views of paradise, di ba? Na hindi
Mm-mm.
naman siya palaging good thing pala, especially sa
Yeah.
indigenous view.
Mm-mm.
Correct me if I am wrong, no? Pero it seems like when we are asked how is our notion of heaven manifested in our environment, yung colonial view, they are leaning towards something that is with man-made characteristics, because you mentioned the
Yes.
garden and such. While the indigenous view, they are leaning towards sa mga natural landforms, like you've mentioned the mountains uh,
Yes.
of our Visayas
That's
island, and then they just
it's
categorize
true.
them in different realms. So, can you please expound why is that? Wala ba yung indigenous view ba? Wala pa silang idea ng garden, like man-made garden or
Ah,
man-made
okay.
landform?
All right. Um, Perhaps I should have gone even further back. Origin stories, doon mention. Yan. Okay? Almost all of the deities were gardeners. Okay? Gardeners, as in, if God Himself, Yahweh, the Creator, was a gardener, so were the local deities. They were also gardeners. Okay? Pasensya, I'm reaching behind me for a copy of my dad's book, okay, on Outline of Philippine Mythology. And dito, the creation of the world, ang dami niyang put together yung summaries of the creations of the world. So for example, in Luzon, he was May Kapal, the creator god. And ito, just one thing. Creating order out of chaos. Sineparate niya heaven and earth. So,
Mm.
naluluto parate, masyadong malapit ang araw. Hiniwalay niya, and then he started introducing a rain, and then nagtanim siya. All the gods. Another one, tungkong sa Bisaya, tungkong langit at alunsina. It's a, but this one is a very fascinating story. It's also one of my favorites, because tungkong langit was a creator, a maker. Ayan, a maker and a gardener. Alunsina, his wife. right? Was ito, this reflected a traditional view: the man working outside the house, the woman taking care of the household. So we can react to however way we look at it, but this is the received story. But the Alunsina and Tungkong Langit story has a bittersweet dimension to it, kasi nag-away sila because Tungkong Langit was always out. Alunsina is wondering, saan ba pumupunta yung asawa ko? Kung gano'n. And then she sent the minions, the wind, to spy upon Tungkong Langit. And then he got angry because tayong dalawa na sa mundong ito, wala ka pang tiwala sa akin. That's a very interesting line, di ba? And then, nag-away sila, nagtampo si Alonsina, tumakbo, Tungkong Langit, realized what he had done was in despair, he went looking for Alonsina and could never find her anymore. So para akitin niyang bumalik, hinagis niya yung suklay. This is the classic na half-moon shaped comb. Threw it into
Mhm.
the sky, it became the moon. He threw her mirror into the sky, it became the sun. He threw her jewels into the sky, they became the stars. And then he was still lonely, so he began to create new things. He planted a garden, and then he began to create humans, the story of the first humans. So
I
imagine mo, no,
see.
yung origin stories and gardens
Yes.
making things,
Yes.
making a landscape is rooted upon human emotions, upon human relationships, and why as a consequence, out of sorrow comes beauty. That's one.
Hmm.
No?
Yes.
Aluncina is also the name for several deities, and she's going to appear in several other origin stories. And yes, because this is Women's Month, near the end of the time, Women's Month,
Yes.
Aluncina is also an archetype of strong femininity in so many mythologies. Okay, and
All
capable of
right.
exercising her own agency. In this
All
case, though, it's I don't know. It could also be, well, if somebody's going to pick it up and make a rom-com out of it, I'd like to see how that works. No?
right.
Especially yung
Yeah.
mga magagandang hirit ala Piolo Pascual.
Yes, mhm. Kung may
Undeserved
ano
lahat
po
sa
'no,
puro
kung may
reason. Oo.
adaptation ngayon.
Yeah.
Alright, sige. So thank you for
Mm-mm.
your answer, Prof. Facano. So,
Mm-mm.
we'll get back to you
Yes. Okay.
later. I'm sure that the audience is, equally intrigued and
Mm-mm.
enlightened at the same time by our
Mm-mm.
topic. So, ayan. So, see you later po, Prof.
Sure.
Facano. Thank you. All right. Now that we have established the connection between the heaven and earth, as well as the other mythical creatures, di ba, yung mga kabilang mundo, let us now take our discussion further on how the concept of heaven and Garden of Eden are translated to the physical plane using the practice of landscape architecture. For our next guest, she is one of the first batch of graduates of B Landscape Architecture from UP Diliman, and then she joined the UP College of Architecture faculty after finishing her degree on Master of Tropical Landscape Architecture. From there, she served as a program director for several years until her retirement, and she is still serving the university in her capacity as professorial lecturer and mentoring a number of students currently working on their thesis. Her professional knowledge and experience cover more than 40 years of not only teaching but also all the aspects of landscape architecture, from being a senior associate in IP Santos and Associates, becoming a partner in PDAA Design International, to writing numerous papers in the field of landscape architecture. Her latest accolade is that she is a recipient of the ninth Philippine Federation of Professional Associations Distinction Award 2022 for the Landscape Architecture Profession Academe Research Development category. She is currently the chair of the Technical Committee for Landscape Architecture of CHED, member of the CPSP CATS Committee on Landscape Architecture of PRC, head of the National Committee on Architecture and Allied Arts of NCCA, and executive committee member of Asia Cultural Landscape Association. Wow, so joining us here tonight, my undergraduate thesis advisor and mentor, Professor Zenaida de la Cruz Galigan. Hi, Ma'am G. Welcome here to
Hi,
PALAKwento.
Bianca. I'm
Yes.
glad to be here to see
Thank
all of you
you.
again.
Yes, thank you for joining us here. First of all, Ma'am G, happy Women's Month po sa inyo. Yan. Kamusta po kayo, Ma'am G?
Oh, I'm fine. Now I can go out after 2 years of lockdown and quarantine. So finally can go out again and
Oh,
at
that's
least meet face to face.
yes. I'm happy to see that. And we just met, di ba, personally, Ma'am G. So after so many years. So yes. So a while ago, Mom G, I mentioned how this whole episode is, inspired by Mom Dolly Perez's design concept and philosophy, 'di ba po? Yung wherein you create heaven and garden of Eden sa mga residential landscapes natin. So, question lang po, do you have any fond memories, 'di ba, with Mom Dolly Perez, like mga quotable quotes, yan, or
Yeah,
activities
actually,
together?
yes, actually, Bianca, listening to Professor Hocano, I distinctly remember Daddy in one of her lectures saying that God is the first landscape architect because he created the Garden of Eden. So, yun yung talagang very memorable quote from her. And also, she said that uh, the scope of our work has no boundary. Okay, so no limitation. So because our roof is the sky, the knows we can go forever there. So the whole world is our work. So like that. So there's no limitation on how we can go about the work of a landscape architect. And those are two of my most memorable quotes from Dali. And Dali was my teacher also in graduate in some of my graduate subjects. And she was very fun to work with. She doesn't want to be called Mrs. Perez or just said, just call me Dali. So
Yeah.
we just call her Dali. It
Mm.
was it's really very live and very proud of our profession. So thing.
Yeah, so that's so nice to hear, Mom G. Thank you for sharing that. So just going back to our topic at hand. So when the University of the Philippines, implemented the general education curriculum years ago, I'm not sure, like, yeah,
Ah, yeah,
around early 2000s po ba? So
yes.
I just yeah, so
Actually,
yes,
yeah, actually, Bianca, the university decided to revitalize the GE program. That's why the RJEP, Revitalize
mm,
General Education Program. So that was in 2001. And then, of course, sinamantala na namin to to get the
yes, yes,
opportunity
yes.
to because during that time, so they're thinking that so the students will be uh will they get interested more to study the subjects that they want to take. So instead of the general education that being forced to you to get required, etc. So the students will have the choice to get whatever GE courses they like or they're
Mm,
interested with. So the all the colleges were encouraged to introduce their own general education. So ito na yun. Sabi na, okay, this is people really are not acquainted or not familiar with what landscape architecture is. So very few people know what landscape architecture is. Since I studied way back in the 70s, and even when I first taught in UP, there are not many people are acquainted or really are familiar with landscape architecture. they even said that we are just glorified gardeners.
Wilderness,
So,
yes.
well, anyway, it's fine. It's fine. Di naman ako na insulto doon. Well, uh, okay lang because for me, I know what a landscape architect is. So, we conceptualize together with Rico Flor. Enrico Flor is working then at the research. Siya yung research associates. No? So, we conceptualize GE, the LA1, which will encompass all the 5 domains of the general education program. Actually, di namin alam kung ma-approve yun. But we try. Talaga, we try to, inano namin. So, okay, fine. So, you may recall, or if those people or those students of mine that had taken GE before, well, it's I'm looking now at the syllabus of what we have included. And then, of course, it has to be catchy. The title itself to be catchy. So we had it. The title of LA1 is Designing Eden, Introduction to Philippine Landscape Architecture. So since Eden's paradise and God is the first landscape architect, and we aim to produce an Eden or to recreate an Eden, which is always the ambition of man to have to experience paradise on earth.
Oh, I
So,
see.
isn't it that at least we will be a tool in creating something that people will enjoy as, of course, landscape architecture as maybe you can give you can describe what landscape architecture is. You can define. The short definition, of course, is uh,
May may ano pa, may graded recitation. Of course. Yeah, Ma'am G, I just parang na-realize ko lang pala kaya pala Super GE ang LRC1. So for our audience, when we say Super GE when during undergrad, pwede siya as AH. Pwede
yes,
siya AH,
lahat.
SSP,
Kasi
and
under all 5 domains siya.
MSP.
So,
Yes,
ayun,
ayun.
mga
So,
ano.
thank you for
Oh,
explaining that, Ma'am G.
yung gano'n yun. So, it's super G siya kasi pwede siyang under math, science, technology, arts and
Mm-hmm.
humanities. Ano pa ba yung mga domain na yun noon?
The MST po, science, the science
Math, science,
part,
and
yes.
mga social science and philosophies,
Mm-hmm.
SSP, mga
Yes.
gano'n, AH,
Yes.
SSP yun, MST, tapos
Ah.
meron pang, well, lahat ng domains. Kaya, meron pa yung Philippine Studies.
Ah,
Under
okay,
Philippine
yes.
Studies siya. Kaya, di ba, you are required to get 2 courses of Philippine Studies. So,
Mm-hmm.
under pa rin
Mm-hmm.
doon yung LA1. So, kaya nga,
Pasok sa lahat ng checklist.
oo, kaya very popular siya. Kaya laging yung waitlisted na estudyante doon, super dami talaga.
Exactly. Yes.
And I think, pag freshman, pag first semester, laging ang estudyante, puro freshman. I think siguro, ano ko lang to, baka yung mga advisor, sasabihin nila sa estudyante nila, o yan, kunin mo yan. Kasi kahit saang domain pwede, hindi sila magkakamali. Saka yung mga freshmen, kukunin na nila yan. Kasi nga kahit saan nila iswap, pwede yun.
Yeah
Diba?
po.
So,
Yes.
they can get any kahit saang domain,
Mm-hmm.
pwede siya. So, yun yung maganda dun sa GE na yan.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't realize na yun nga, ma-approve siya. Pero kasi naman, talagang we try to incorporate how the different sciences, whether it's applied science or yung sociology, etc., all those different studies, they are related. We study that because we need that. we need to study the user to understand them. Then we applied math and the different sciences in the design of the land. So talagang related lahat yung mga yon. So you can see na why even the arts, history, all those things, we need to know that. So we can learn from the masters before, and then what we can not necessarily perfect the what they have done before, but at least we can learn from what is best or what is bad. So we don't repeat
Yes.
the mistakes that they have done. So
Yes.
those things is very important also. So we can relate those in other domains, all those domains, even philosophy. So, iba,
Yes.
you
So
know that we have to study all of those.
exactly po, Ma'am G. Ma'am G, I'm curious naman as to how the specific parts or like the outline of the LA1 course really embody the theme of designing Eden. May pa-plate din po ba 'yan? May pa-history para ba siyang uh,
Yeah, actually, yung
yes.
first part ng LA1 is really, ito yung title niya. This is the design brief, okay? History and overview of Philippine landscape architecture. So, introduction talaga. So, this is the part wherein you explain what landscape architecture, who are the forefathers or the one who start the landscape architecture. That's why meron dito part na BPAD, BIPAD, before IP Santos and Dolly Perez. So, yan. So, people should know who are the pioneers in the practice of landscape architecture in the Philippines who started them. So, yun, history. So, and before Dali, how is it? How's the practice? So we have to study also the landscape architecture practice in the different parts of the world. So even yung mga, di ba kaya nga yung we study about the hanging gardens of Babylon, so mga ganon. So pati yung mga binanggit kanina ni Professor Hocano, so yung mga different gardens, so yung Islamic garden, we have to study, and then from there, we can also relate on how it evolves up to the present. Mga ganon. So from the even during the Egyptian time, etc.
I
Although, so
see.
and then the next part is, of course, knowing the site. So, yun, the natural science in Philippine landscape architecture, the physical sciences. So, geology, the parent material of the landscape. So we have to understand geology, geography, meteorology, even anthropology, sociology, all of those things, because we have to also kasi knowing the site is yung applied sciences, and then the third part is, have you looked into the users? So understanding the users. So it's the part where psychology, anthropology, sociocultural geography, history, arts, etc., and even business economics come into play. So we have to understand all of those. But of course, we need to get the expertise of also of those related scientists. We cannot be everything. So we have to understand, but we also have to consult with us, that the other people, engineers, etc. So social scientists, if the area is too big, so we need their expertise also on that. That's why we have to get the expertise of the who ano yun? Biglang naalala. Yung sa mga when you do site
Social
evaluation,
worker, social
mas
worker.
pati, yeah, isa pa yon. And then also environmental impact
Yes,
statement, yung
EIAs,
mga
yes.
mga yon. So those
Mhm.
things, syempre hindi naman natin kayang gawin lahat yon. So
Mhm.
we collaborate with the other consultants.
Okay.
Yung kaya talagang, and then of course at the last yung the landscape usage. the students say on Philippine landscape architecture. So, ano yun? So, how do you apply also these theories and all those things that you have learned? So, sort of a test, but not really kasi yung test natin is we try to make it more interesting. Not only written test, but at least there is also a practical test
Mm-hmm.
wherein you, at least, for example, you can make a dish garden out of the you can apply all the things that you. So even the non-LA students can really appreciate how it is. Sorry. Nawala yung
Okay.
kontik nang mawala
Commercial.
ang yung battery low daw, low battery.
Yes, yes. Yes, ma'am.
So,
You were saying sa mga students po. Yes.
oo. Tapos ano, and also this is the part wherein you try to show the students also the works of the landscape architects, the actual works. So they will really have a grasp of what we do. Something like that.
Very very interesting ano po no. GE course is like a compressed version ng ano po ng landscape architecture program pala.
Kaya nga, ano lang, kaya yung type natin is an overview. Overview lang
Yes,
siya
yes.
para maintindihan lang nila kung ano ba
Mhm.
talaga yung landscape architecture. Pero they can understand. At the same time, they'll learn something practical that they can
Mhm.
apply sa ginagawa din nila sa bahay. Minsan sinasabi ko, sige, you make that dish garden so that your parents will appreciate kung ano talaga yung natutunan nyo. Di ba very
Yes.
practical ngayon, lalo na ngayong pandemic.
Pandemic,
Like,
yes. Opo.
nagkaroon biglang marami ng mga plantitas. And
Plantitas,
then
yes.
also, di ba yung parang na-apply din natin doon sa ating Luntiang Pook na project.
Mhm.
So,
Of
yung
course.
mga yon, how we educate also the layman on the
Mhm.
importance of landscape architecture also.
Yes.
So,
So, Ma'am G, may ito lang po yung last question ko for our segment, no. How was the perception of your LA1 students considering that, they are from different programs sa UP? Um,
siguro perception ko muna.
sige, sige, ma'am.
Kasi, actually, I really enjoy teaching LA1 kasi they are from different colleges. So, iba-iba talaga. So, and there is a very interesting and lively exchange of ideas sa kanila. So, minsan natutuwa nga ako talaga kasi lalo na yung nakikita ko talaga kung sino yung mga bata talagang ano yun, ano yung term nyo, bibo
Di ba?
kids talaga na andyan, mga gusto nila. So, laging talagang very lively yung discussion. Talagang
Mhm.
maraming ano. So, maybe perception ko din yun at maybe yun din yung perception nila na kung mga interested ko sila doon sa mga ginagawa namin. So, and minsan parang pag meron kasing part na nagre-report sila, parang silang sobrang bibo sa
Mm,
pagre-report, gagawa sila ng
yes.
mga iba-ibang style to attract
Wow.
the attention of their classmates,
Very
mga
well
gano'n.
prepared.
Oo, talaga sabi ko,
Yeah.
talagang mga yun nga, lalo na yung mga kasi nga iba-ibang idea. So, they they learn from me and I learn from them also.
Mhm.
Mga
Yun.
ganon. Kasi kung ano yung mga perception nila, nakikita ko din sa the way
Sa output
they,
nila, ma'am, 'di ba po?
oo,
Yes.
sa output nila.
Hmm.
Kahit na, minsan pinapag-sketch ko sila. So,
Okay.
kasi sabi ko, hindi naman, I'm not grading you based on your skill, but on your enthusiasm and how you really work on the drawing itself. Hindi kasi, sabi ko, hindi ko pwedeng ikumpara yung arty students doon sa mga engineering and science students na hindi naman talaga nagdo-drawing, walang
Yes
skills.
po.
Pero
Mhm.
at least they tried very hard, no, to work on
Mhm.
it, mga ganon. So, nakakatuwa rin.
Alright. Yes, that's so nice to hear, Ma'am Gino. As you know, as someone na kami kasi 'di ba, hindi naman kami nakapag LA1 pero thank you for sharing that story. So, ayun lang po muna tayo, Ma'am G.
Oo, sige.
Pero later babalik po tayo for question and answer portion. Thank you so much po.
Yes, thank you also for
Okay.
having me here.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am G. So, yan. Again, we would like to, highlight the importance, no, of how Mom G shared to us the story behind the creation of LA1 Designing Eden, the introduction to Philippine landscape architecture. Kaya naman pala talagang ano siya, very high demand, 'di ba? Very in demand kahit ano na, kahit ilang years na siyang na-create. All right. Our next two guests are former LA1 students, actually. And what's interesting is that after taking LA1, they decided to shift to landscape architecture programs and are now successful in their respective fields. So, our third guest is Miss Isel Alvarez. She is a graduate of Master of Tropical Landscape Architecture at University of the Philippines. She's a member of International Association of Landscape Ecology and a champion of bio, Biodiversinec landscape design. Her research and design works and publications are focused on urban ecological network simulation, placekeeping, use of GIS tools, urban parks, and healing landscapes. So, unfortunately, she's not available to join us tonight, but she sent us a video to share her experiences about LA1 and how it kind of shifted her career afterward. So we'll now play her video in a short while.
Landscape Architecture at University. Hi everyone, I'm Isel May Alvarez, graduate of Master in Tropical Landscape Architecture at University of the Philippines. Before I took my master's, I also took a Bachelor of Arts in European Languages, major in French, and minor in tourism. So it was during my first semester in the first year of my bachelor's degree that I took LA1 or Landscape Architecture 1. So I was a freshie back then, and my idea of landscape architecture is just beautifying the residential landscapes. But the advisor during the enlistment period told me that LA1 is a super GE course and it's difficult to get, but because I'm a freshie, I will instantly get it. So since I also love artworks and my bachelor's degree at the time doesn't involve creating artworks, I thought maybe LA1 will be a nice break from all the stressful courses in my major. So I took it. My professor back then was one of the renowned landscape architects in the Philippines, Professor Zenaida Galingan. And one of the most memorable topic that she discussed is the psychology of spaces. She told us that she loves people watching and she observes how people use the spaces, how people behave in a certain environment, how they respond to a certain design element of a space. And these are the things that help her design the landscape so as to respond to what people need while protecting the environment. So I got fascinated by this aspect of psychology because back then what I knew about psychology is that it leads to the fields of medicine, advertising, but the environmental psychology aspect is more interesting because you can apply this to designing streets, parks, and even on applying it on the larger scale like urban planning, regional planning. So it was really fascinating. So I actually tried to shift to the bachelor's degree of landscape architecture, but because I'm a provinciana, I went home to Bicol during the summer break, and so I did not pursue the application process. So I continued with my bachelor's degree. But one of the activities in LA1, which I think had an impact on the rest of my college life in UP, is the activity wherein we had to observe the behavior or the traffic of students in a certain college, how they use the spaces, what are their needs, what's the current condition of the environment, what happens when it's rainy, what happens when it's sunny, when it's noontime. We had to come up with a plan on how we can design the landscape around the building and even the spaces inside the building in relation to the surrounding environment. So I really learned a lot of things from that activity. And it was in the fourth year in my marketing class in tourism wherein I saw the impact of this activity, because we were tasked to do a marketing plan for recreational spaces in Metro Manila. Our group was assigned to the Ninoy Aquino Parks and Wildlife Center. So just like what I learned in LA1, I did a site inventory. I interviewed the staff. I checked what are the activities that you can do in the park. However, while I was doing the marketing plan, I realized I do not want to just think about strategies on how to market what was currently in the park. I wanted to change the pathways, the outdoor furniture. I wanted to change them all, the design of that, and I wanted to have different amenities. I wanted to transfer the existing amenities to other areas of the park, just so the animals residing in the park can have a better life. So these are things that I learned in LA1. So basically I wanted to change a lot in the design of the park, and those are things that I cannot do if I'll just be a marketer of tourism. I wanted to boost the marketability of the place, but not with marketing strategies that are currently being done, in the business, but by modifying the design of the place. So I guess that was a turning point when I fully realized I was in the wrong career path. But I finished my degree and with honors, but I wasn't satisfied. So after 1 year of working, I decided to take a master's degree. But at the time, I was still trying to figure out the career that I want. I was in a dilemma of wanting different fields of work like advertising, international relations, film, animation. I wanted to study law, but my interest was limited to environmental laws. I love studying about ecology, the arts, drawing, creating artworks. I love analyzing how people think. So these are things that I actually have to learn in landscape architecture, because you have to consider a lot of things before you can come up with a design that will have a big impact or change a landscape surface. So landscape architecture is actually a plethora of several fields that I was interested in. And thankfully, my friend, who's a landscape architect, Kuya Adrian Ilog, he called me and he said, "Hey, I remember you like LA1 when you were in college, and I heard that you want to take a master's degree. So here's the good news. You can take master's in tropical landscape architecture in UP. You just need to take 2 years of back subjects." So without hesitation, I took the master's degree. And yes, I guess that's how LA1 influenced my decision in taking a second degree or master's in landscape architecture. And yeah, that's the story of how LA1 influenced or changed the way I look at my environment, always looking at how different professions, fields of work affect the design of our spaces and how spaces affect our behavior. And since the time that I took LA1, it really changed how I see things. And what I realized is that people are not actually totally free to go wherever they want or do whatever they want to do. They will always be limited by the design of the spaces. No matter how great they are, no matter who they are, they can still only go where the designers or architects led them. And I think that's a great power that landscape architects hold. But with the great power comes great responsibility.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So once again, I just would like to thank Isel for sharing her story, and of course, congratulations for pushing through with your passion. So with that, let's now proceed to our last guest, but definitely not the least. She is a landscape architect and urban planner whose work focuses on project development in transportation and mobility in the public sector. She graduated from the University of the Philippines in 2015. She then took a graduate diploma course from the UP School of Urban Planning and finished it in 2018. In 2020, she underwent a master's degree program in public management, strategy, and global management, finance, and macroeconomic policy from the KDI School of Public Policy and Management in Sejong City, South Korea. She is now working in the Department of Transportation and is also a senior lecturer in the Environmental Landscape Studio Laboratory of UP College of Architecture. Everyone, please welcome landscape architect Joyce Aguirre. Hi, Joyce. Welcome to PALAKwento and happy Women's Month to you.
Hi, Bianca. Happy Women's Month as well. And I'm happy to be here. I'm delighted to be a part of this episode today.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah,
accepting our invite. So, how are you right now?
I'm good. Well, actually, yeah. I mean, it's been busy 2 months. I think in the public sector, it's quite um, especially for the ones handling the project because we have to take care of COMELEC exemptions for our project so
Mm,
we can continue working on them. So it's been busy but yet always fulfilling naman the work.
yes, ano kasi no may ban nga pala no before, tama, before and
Yes.
after elections, all right.
Yeah.
So, ayun. So yes, so we are just talking about how LA1 encourage you to shift to be landscape architecture program, but before that, let's just rewind a bit. Why did you take LA1 as your GE course?
Well, I think as Prof. Galingan mentioned, and also I think a lot of the freshmen, I took it as a freshman, become attracted to landscape architecture. One, because of the super GE aspect of it. And, I mean, I think when I took it in 2010, I think it was one of the first years that LA1 was being offered. And I didn't realize how lucky I was to be able to take it. Kasi I heard nga na it's very in demand. But I knew that after na lang, like when I already was in the program. And I forgot already if I took it for first sem or second sem. But I remember uh, I don't remember much about the class kasi it's already, parang ano eh, it's like LA19. Parang a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of it is like LA19. But also it's a lot more kasi nga it's an overview course. And it, ano, I remember being very fascinated about it because it's a it's a mix of creativity and science. Like uh, you can do creative solutions yet yet being very functional. There is parang science behind the beauty that you create. So I remember being fascinated about that, and I was in my I was in the chemical engineering program, which I really thought I liked it, But upon entering, when I was starting taking the course, I realized that it's not for me. So, ayun. And I was actually thinking of shifting somewhere else, but taking LA1 gave me another option for shifting. And yun nga, the second year, my second year in UP, I was able to already shift and start
Mm.
my classes in landscape architecture.
Are there any specific class activities or maybe reporting assignments ganyan or paper wow or
Mm-hmm.
paper na it that really helped you cultivate your curiosity in the field of landscape architecture?
I don't really remember too much about the class.
Okay lang.
Um, yeah, I mean, kasi nga parang it started just mixing together with all the other LA
Mhm.
classes that I took
Mhm.
after that. But I think what I really remember being fascinated about it, and I remember even my professor was Prof Espino, and I remember asking her how to shift. And like that was the start of my journey, I think, na parang at the tail end of the course I was already really looking into it, and parang I asked her about more about LA and how to
Mhm.
parang how to shift and where parang if she can point me to the right direction on how to do that.
Okay, so I guess yung overall experience mo sa LA1, parang siya na yung naging, alam mo yun, parang striking moment, di ba? Parang na-realize mo. Parang it all just
Yeah.
came together na
Yeah.
L-ARC ang kukunin mong course next year. So that's a very interesting story. Sige, so after taking LA1, how did it change your perspective? 'Di ba sabi kasi Designing Eden, 'di ba yung title ng LA1. So how did
Mm.
it change your perspective in creating your own Eden through the field of landscape architecture?
Yeah, I think medyo similar dun sa sinabi ni Aisel earlier na
Mhm.
being a designer kasi, 'di ba parang besides being able to create something beautiful yet functional, you being in that position is powerful kasi you kind of dictate what the environment that the people around you will experience. So that's where people parang when people associate memories, it will be within the space that you created. And I think that's really an aspect that also parang it came with the fascination of the course kasi it's parang also the environment that we design um is larger in scale. So outdoors. So parang it's not confined. Of course, it is of course somewhat there are limits, but it is not constrained na in a way na you are in a shell and limited in within to design within that structure. Parang
Mhm.
I think in that sense, uh, I felt that LA being an LA puts you in a position that that can help parang you can influence ayun you can influence how people will remember and be efficient or what activities they can do in this space. And I think in that sense, um I that really parang helped me parang encouraged me to shift. And because I came from engineering,
Mhm.
and we didn't really have a lot of that creative outlet. And I think I think still that shifting to LA is still one of the best decisions I did. And I mean, I not only that the course itself, the program itself is really good, and I think I met a lot of my really good friends until today. And I think hindi na magbago. I don't know. uh, uh, I'm still close to them. So, ayun. I still think it's one of the best decisions I did.
Yeah, very well said. So maybe for my last question na lang, no. So after shifting to BLR program, how did you find it? Like, are there, maybe you can share some highlights during your undergrad studies or even during your professional practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when I'm already in the program, well, ano ba? When I was already in the program, I think I think what for me, like personally, what became a challenge is that I'm not really very good at sketching, and so and I realized how important it is, parang almost right away when I shifted, and I mean I practiced, of course. It became of course it became a part of what I do every day with the plates and other outputs. But besides that, I parang my journey in through the course in taking landscape architecture, parang I kind of knew where my strength is in the spectrum of the things that landscape architects can do, and that's why I focused on what I think I will enjoy the most, which is the large scale planning, and even regarding mobility and transportation. And, like,
Mm-hmm.
because when you take landscape architecture, there are many fields or many tracks that you can go to after, and ayun, parang that journey helped me realize where in the big picture of landscape architecture I fit.
Wow. So, ayun, very inspiring story, 'di ba? From, determining your weaknesses and then as well as your strengths, 'di ba? And now you are very successful in the field that you have chosen. So, thank you for sharing your story, Joyce. And I'll see you later sa ating Q&A.
All right.
Yeah. So before we go to our Q&A session, let's just synthesize what we have learned so far. So we were able to deep dive, 'di ba, into the different notions of heaven, Garden of Eden yan, and pati yung concept ng kabilang mundo in relation to Philippine mythology and how this manifests in our environment, in our country. And then eventually it we translated to the physical plane using the practice of landscape architecture. That's why we have the LARC1 course, Designing Eden, diba? Introduction to Philippine Landscape Architecture, under the GE curriculum of UP Diliman. And then from there, we met two previous students from LA1, and we got to know how LA1 influenced the shift in their career paths. So having said all that, let's now proceed to our Q&A portion. So we would like to invite our guests again to join us in the forum. And landscape architect Alfonso Ancheta, the OG PALAKwento host, will also be joining us for our Q&A. So yan, hi Fonso, hi ulit sa ating mga guests. And so to our audience, please type in your questions di, sa Facebook, we're live din sa YouTube, di ba? Yan. Sige. So while waiting uh, for the questions from our audience, maybe our guests could describe their Garden of Eden or heaven here on earth.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Hirap.
Hindi.
Naging philosophical bigla.
Hmm.
Who would like to start? Sige, si Prof. Ocano.
Sabi na nga ba eh.
Si
May person,
first nag-react.
ay nako, yung unang napareact, no? May personal Garden of Eden. Oh my goodness. I have gardens of Eden. Would you believe? They each represent a stage in my life. Eh. I'm an alumnus of OB Montessori Center in Santa Ana branch. And in the Santa Ana branch, that was a converted compound. Two huge houses, the huge classic bahay na bato design, but all cement. It's more of a contemporary 50s. It had a more 50s/60s feel. Then when they converted it into a school, nagdagdag pa ng mga structures yan eh. The front lawn was already a huge space for, at least relative to us, uh, when you're about roughly between the age of 7 up to 13, 14, 15, malaking space. Of course, when I went back years later, ba't ang liit? Yung nga pala, no? Kasi I'm older. But the front lawn was ringed by trees. It was a place where we could all run. But the back one, yun yung para siyang, ika nga sa kanta in the movie, or Secret Garden. We could climb trees. We could climb over the wall to the garden on the other side of the compound and still run around, back and forth, back and forth. It was a wonderful place. Tamang-tama nga doon sa philosophy of Maria Montessori. You learn by playing. And so you learn a lot of things. You didn't realize what you learned until much later on when you played. The other Garden of Eden, when I was in high school, UPIS, right? And that was at the old campus where UP Town Center now stands. And it was a huge space. Okay? You run around everywhere. Not as small and intimate as the one at OBMC. The the third one, when in college, surprisingly, people think of the lagoon, the actual sunken garden, the lagoon. I wasn't fully cleaned up yet, but it was still a nice place to just hang around in from time to time. But the other place, when I had the chance to visit, was that garden created around the CRL. Okay, that one was a beautiful space kasi it followed the culture of the land. And in kay Jerusalino Araos, okay, that was his masterpiece. That and the Sunken Garden. Now it's called the One Luna Parade Ground. But arguably, during the pandemic, it was my dad's garden that became a kind of a secret garden of our own, where we could harvest fruits, we could harvest bananas, avocados. Um, Sometimes I used it as my practice area for our niece, and a place where you did battle with pestiferous insects. Okay, gardens are not just simply places of beauty; they're also battlefields. And if you're trying to deal with pests, you know exactly what I mean. Yun lang. These were sorts of things that sometimes you think about it from when God was creating Eden. What did He have in mind when we create gardens? How do we what you know? If you're a Christian, whether Catholic or Protestant, and you create a garden, surely at some point the Garden of Eden becomes an inspiration, right? So what do you'd have to think, what does your Eden look like? And that was something. Mine underwent several transformations, and I'm sure there'll be more to come, more changes to come before we leave this earth. Yeah, yun lang. Sorry, medyo I rambled a bit, but I took you through a bit of chronology there. Parang
It's very
nag-excavate ng memories. Parang Arthur.
yes, it's very sentimental, Prof. Ocano.
Mm-mm.
Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. Sige. Maybe Ma'am G, would you like to share your Garden of Eden?
You're muted, ma'am.
Well,
Yes, we can hear you now.
uh, it's hard to answer that question because as an experienced landscape architect, uh, I was able to design so much areas. So, but I remember yung first project ko, talaga yung first project ko na residential, yun ang pinaka-memorable sa akin. Yung first ano ko talaga. Yung talagang yung, ah, 'cause I didn't realize na when it was done, it would be like that. So it's quite, the changes in elevation is great. So, and then I remember the architect doing it as if it's flat. And then on the actual, when we saw it, it's really the difference in elevations around more than 2 meters. I think from the lanai level of the house going down, and then so and the house already there. So I was able to design it by creating different levels of steps and etc. So it became so nice, and the feeling I got when I saw it was that is so much different. Even when I finished so many big developments, etc. like that. So I can say that maybe through that small garden, so I had my first glimpse of Eden or paradise. Yung ano. But of course, sa bahay namin ngayon during the pandemic, even if our spaces is wrong than the terrace and small, I think it's already a garden paradise for me. It's at least yun yung aking during the pandemic and all. My son is on was kidding already the saying na dapat matapos na tong pandemic na to at mukhang mauubusan na kami ng space lahat na nag-green tag ko. Oo nga, pati nga wall eh. Tingnan mo, nakaano na yan. So, yung ano, so it's not in whether it's small or big, as long as you're happy and contented in that area, I think you can consider it your Eden, your garden. I want to have more elements there. I want to have a waterfall, cascading water, etc. like that. That is it. But I know that it's not practical. So something like that. Even if I want a swimming pool, even if I have a big garden, I will not put a swimming pool because it's not practical. Something like that. So at the end, hindi ko na siya magiging Eden. Nilagyan ko siya ng something na sasakit lang yung ulo ko. So, ganon. Pero, for me, as long as the area is beautifully designed, kahit nasaan siya, and then all my loved ones there will be with me, that will be my Eden. So, mga ganon. But personally, I like spaces na talagang may room. Magandang garden. So, that's it.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Ma'am G. Again, no, very very personal talaga and very close to our feelings, 'di ba? Yung concept natin ng Garden of Eden. So, Joyce?
Hi, yeah. So for me, I think I'll share the first thing that actually came into me. I when I say the word Eden, I think what I associate it with was our our immediate neighborhood when I was a kid. Kasi actually I'm still in the part of our village where there's not a lot of houses. But I think for some years before, there really weren't any houses before dito sa bahay, dito sa village, sa part ng village namin. And we can go around and then meron, actually palayan pa yun before eh. We can walk around and there's so much fresh air. Lalabas lang kami. And, there's nothing na, parang, it's, of course, it's not, parang it's just streets and then, yung palayan. But it's very peaceful, I'd say, na, of course, in combination na I was a kid then, of course, wala ka pa iniisip. But, I think, and still today, there are parts of our village na, ano na wala pa masyado nakatira, and I still think they're very peaceful. Like you can just walk, you can bike, and wala kang pupuntahan but just to go around. Parang I think that kind of activity clears your head. Parang it makes you um, parang it gives you clarity in some way. So I think for me that is a good I think for me at least that's my Eden. But I think my philosophical Eden, I think that's something that I'm still trying to figure out. But I think I'm slowly getting there. Parang as you get to know yourself better, as you grow older.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, choice. So, pati on a philosophical level, na touch natin yon. Okay. So maybe Fonso, would you like to share your concept of Eden as well?
Well, I am lucky enough to be able to grow up with a garden at home, because not that many people get to grow up with a garden at home. And um I am also lucky enough that my tita was also a landscape architect, and I grew up also seeing works of Tita Dolly, and I saw what a nice garden would be at a very young age. So for me, it would be something with very typical. I'm an outdoors person, so I'm an outdoorsy person. So something with a really big lawn, lush greens around, and places where you can just hang out and sit down and in the shade. That for me, that's enough. Like I you can do so much with that space already. And yeah, parang for me, it's like, yeah, relax lang.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Fonso. We actually have a query for Professor Hokano from landscape architect Diki.
Mhm.
So, not sure if I understand your talk
Oh,
right, but if in indigenous beliefs the afterlife is another version of this life, was there any excitement for the afterlife, or if
oh,
life and death are just one continuous existence?
oh.
Western and Islamic concepts of the afterlife seem to be more appealing in terms of its problem free or a carefree existence. What then would the indigenous peoples have to look forward to? Paradise has its advantages, I think.
Okay. Let me see. Yeah, so for as long as the question is flashed, sana, can you flash it back again, the screen? Ah, nawala na? Hindi na pwede? Okay.
Ayan,
Yan.
ayan,
Okay, yan. Thank you.
pwede sir.
Yon. Okay. First, excitement for the afterlife, or if life and death are just one continuous existence. So we're talking about indigenous peoples separate from Islam and Christianity. I can only speak about what we find in uh, both ethnography and in, well, ito yung studies in Philippine folk mythology, right? Indigenous knowledge. But if you're looking at mythology as the source of a people's worldview, it's a continuum. Death, this is an explanation why death rituals are about maintaining the continuity of the departed person with the present person. Oh, and by the way, in some communities, especially sa Cordillera, the the dead are also integrated into the household. And so there's a specific ritual. I'll cite an example in which after maybe 10 years, during which time the body of the deceased turned, has turned into bones, okay? There's a practice for secondary burial in which the bones are then exhumed, they are washed, and then they are placed in a jar and buried with appropriate rituals, like the bumbaki. Here's the interesting part. They're buried in the equivalent of a garden. So your garden is not only a space for relaxing, for enjoying yourself, but it's also where the ancestor, the dead ancestor, is placed, so that now the ancestor is now treated as a guardian of the house and by extension of the community. So there's a continuity. I don't know, maybe if you could look at it this way, if I use that as an example, and there is at least one famous anthropologist who was given that treatment because he moved here and he lived and died here, and he was given that ritual. He was made an anito of the community. The ritual was televised on ABS-CBN, and that anthropologist happens to be H. Otley Bayer. Okay, he's an anito now of the community up there in the Cordillera, and this is not only this. Of course, over time, some of the rituals, the specific parts may change, but one of our former students who comes from that place also died, and she was given the death ritual after her after she was ano to, cremated. Okay, and then yes, in a part of the property, in a small house on a part of the property, surrounded by the trees, the she was placed there. So yung gardens are have more than one significance. They are also places where your ancestors can stay, and they are places where you're going to be inhabiting because they're protectors now. So in a sense, maybe life and death also mean a transition from one existence to another, and from one uh, set of responsibilities to another. And that's why in that context also you understand why the Catholic in the Catholic sense, well, Catholic majority natin, minsan they have this yearly observation of a ritual for the dead, di ba? Apart from El Dia de Muerte, which is of course yung equivalent ng Halloween, um, yung mga rituals doon na observation of the dead so that they don't feel neglected. And having them around in your garden is certainly one way to keep the house safe. Although for some of us, we may find it a bit creepy because then if the spirits move around, di namumulto din unless the inhabitants get used to them, seeing them as part of the family. So there are all sorts of things at work here, and all sorts of ways in which these beliefs can be given material realities, right? And then let me see. Can we? What about the concept of paradise? Well, it was introduced, yes, both by Islam and Christianity. Is there an advantage? That depends on where you look and how you look at the world. If you're looking forward to ending it because all this world has several problems, then there are some death practices in which, again, sa Visayas, when the dead are brought to the cemetery, sumasayaw sila and tuba is passed around freely. And everybody gets tipsy and they all start singing songs about mabuti pa siya, hindi na niya kailangan harapin yung mga problema ng mundong ito. Yes, it has happened, but if you've noticed also, under a colonial period of history up to the present, the longing for the afterlife has also to be placed in historical and political context. And that also means partly, uh, partly, freedom from the oppression of a hated foreign ruler, and partly also longing for a new life in which the Philippines is freed from that hated colonial oppression. For better context, tignan nyo yung kay Ileto's Passion and Revolution. Now, I'm sorry, we seem to have gotten out far afield. Ano bang kinalaman
Yeah.
ito sa Garden of Eden? But there's multifaceted ways to look at the garden, where your ancestors can stay, or where the place of longing when you can go to. Because in Ileto's work, he documents how the Katipuneros idealized or sang about the freedom from the Philippines as also finally entering a new age of peace and prosperity. And the Philippines will be like a garden again. That's interesting. All of these are tied up with all sorts of so many facets in here. And yes, ay yung tanong sa akin ni
Dicky.
Bianca kanina,
Dicky.
what about early Philippines mythology as
Ah,
makers? O ayun, nandoon.
yeah.
In that sense, we would make our own destiny if we aim to make the Philippines a garden once more. Ayun. Sorry, I think I overshot my time. Pasensya.
Thank you. It's
Dami kong
okay.
talento.
It's okay, Prof. Hakano. We're all interested to your answers. So, just last final word na lang po from our guest. Just one statement. Ano yung gusto nyong last statement nyo to our audience? Maybe you can start with Joyce naman.
To our audience. Well, first, I think very interesting topic today. No, dami ko ring natutunan, and I think I encourage not only the students, the prospective students, and even the others, to take interest on the things like this. Like if you think about it, kala mo garden lang, but there's so much story behind it. I think especially for our students, for landscape architecture students, it it's very interesting to look deeper into our concept of garden from anthropological history or sources. So ayun lang. Thank you again for this opportunity, and again I had a good time and very interesting topic.
Thank you, Joyce. Mom G.
Ah, oh, sorry. I thought it would be. I remember. Well, anyway, I think since most of you have been my students, I always, well, you have to be passionate with what you do. Think, and then as a landscape architect, you really have to understand everything about the site, not only physically, but also culturally. And as Professor Hakana said, there's something there which we had experienced in some of our projects, something that we cannot explain
Mhm.
there. There's a time wherein there was a big tree almost dying on the site, and before we came into the picture, they were trying to bulldoze the tree, but they couldn't because they heard something. Uh, na that so every time we try to para daw ano yung dumadaing. Okay, something like that. So they just retain the tree, and so we have to redesign all the driveway, etc. because of that. So those are the things that we cannot explain, but it's there. So we have to understand the history of the place. What's that? And it happened to be a cemetery before. So maybe plenty died there. Or not really a cemetery, but so, so many people died in that area. So those things. And when you design, okay, you have to understand, of course, the users and how they will react to the place. So we have to understand everything. So I said the culture, how they will react, how the place is, the topography, etc. Everything. So we have to have the feel of the area, and then we have to give our all. So we have to treat it as if it is ours. But we have to remember that we have the clients and the users to satisfy. Mm, that's it.
Thank you so much, Mom G. Prof. Hokano, for your last
Okay.
statement.
Oh, okay. Well, I've encountered this question. Can the country be a heaven or hell? Okay. Taking off from the previous commentary about heaven or hell, indigenous Philippines. Well, put it this way. In the contemporary setting, it's really our decisions that would decide whether we can turn our country into a garden reflecting heaven on earth, or if we can uh, let it be and allow it to go in the way of hell. The choice is really ours. Yeah. And with that, it's up to us to decide how we can take this concept of Eden, of heaven, and make it a reality in our present situation. Right. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Hokano. So again, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And I think that concludes diba, our today's episode of PALAKwento. So I hope nag-enjoy din po kayo as much as we
Mhm.
enjoyed hearing you discuss the different our different topics, but equally related for tonight. So ayun. Thank you so much,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank
Good
you
Okay,
too.
night.
bye.
Thank you too.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Acano, and thanks
Thank you,
everyone.
ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Remember the song, ha?
Thank
Morning has
you.
broken. Ayun.
All
Okay,
right.
Okay.
bye.
Goodbye
Bye-bye. See
po.
you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yes, so once again, this episode is in partnership uh, between Environmental Landscape Studio Laboratory, or ELSL, of UP College of Architecture, and the Philippine Association of Landscape Architects, or PALA. We would also again like to thank our guest speakers, Prof. Felipe Hocano Jr., Professor Zenaida Galingan, Landscape Architect Joyce Aguirre, and Miss Aisel Alvarez, our ELSL coordinator, Professor Napi Navarra, and our PALA board members, our President, Alexa Brillantes, Internals VP, Roaring, our Internals AVP, Herbert Jose, Externals VP, Adrian Ilog, Externals AVP, hi, Alfonso Ancheta, Secretary Joy De La Cruz, Treasurer Susan Aquinoong, and ex-officio Pam Pagana. Yeah, so thank you for having us
Thank you.
here in PALAKwento. So, Fonso, do you have any announcement to our
Right.
audience?
Thank you. Thank you. So, as you've noticed, this season it's actually a new season of Palakwento, and sorry that we abruptly ended our first season. We were still in transitioning. Actually, we still are in transition from the older execom to the new board. So we're still trying to figure that out. But what I can say is that this season will be a little bit different, wherein we'll be moving our time slot from Monday at 8 to Wednesday at 8, because we feel like Wednesday would be a little bit more of a chill day, like parang hump day to get to the weekend type of thing. So you have a little bit more time on your hands. And some episodes naman from this season will be pre-recorded, just so that we can get the parang fullest conversation also going on. And don't worry, the conversation and the content will still be the same. We'll still make sure that it's very intellectual, if not intellectual, very spicy and juicy and nakwento talaga. And if you would like to get in touch with guests, please let us know. We'll give you their contact details so you can have a conversation with them as well. So like what happened today was a little bit different, where episode was, I hope it was able to open up your mind and broaden your horizons and hopefully make you shoot for the stars, since we were talking about heaven on earth nga naman. And yun, thank you also to ELSL for making sure that we focused on the focal point of our palakwento advocacy, if you will, no? And we really focus on like the very words of wisdom and a lot of concepts and ideas that are thrown around that we don't sometimes get to hear, no? So thank you so much. We will also be having episodes every month, at least once a month. We're still trying to figure out the schedule specifically, but for sure we'll be having an episode once a month. If not, we can have one twice, but we'll make sure you'll know beforehand. We'll make sure also you'll know earlier, para at least you're a little bit more prepared. But yeah, there. Thank you so much for hosting, Bianca. I know it's your first time. I hope naman it wasn't so hard also. Um, and you did a good job. I mean,
Oh,
everyone,
thank
there are
you.
so many people, there are people watching naman. And I learned so much. Honestly, I really did learn a lot from today. So thank you for hosting this first episode of the season 2 of Palakwento.
Thank you as well for guiding us, diba? Syempre, I think this is also the first time na may partnership with ELSL, diba? So, and
Yeah,
I hope not the
yeah.
last, I'm
I hope
sure.
also. Yeah,
Yes. So, I guess that's it, diba?
yeah. That's
That's
it.
it for our episode for today. Good night, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Sige.
Night, everyone. Have a
Night.
good evening. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.